So today I'm going to show you guys how to diagnose a bad head gasket. A bad head gasket in an engine has multiple different symptoms that it could be displaying that would indicate a bad head gasket. With that said, a head gasket replacement is not cheap if you're going to pay a shop to do it. I don't know of any car out there right now that is on the market that it's going to be less than $1,000 to replace a head gasket in it. So this is one of those things with it. When you diagnose it, you really want to make sure you've got it right, because it's kind of an expensive endeavor to get it wrong if you're paying somebody to do this for you. So what I'm going to go over in this video is the different symptoms of a bad head gasket. In addition to that, all the different things that a head gasket seals in the engine. So we're going to be able to correlate those symptoms with what part of the head gasket has actually gone bad. So really the first thing that I need to do is, I know that this vehicle has a bad head gasket already. So what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to tear this engine completely down and pull the cylinder head off of it. We're going to take a look at the head gasket together, and then I'm going to show you why a blown head gasket has the symptoms that it has.
So I spent a few evenings after work working on this for a couple hours every night, tearing this engine down to get it to the point that you're going to see. Just to give you an idea of the labor cost on this job. So on this particular car, it's 8.9 hours of labor to change the head gasket in this car. You can put a long block, meaning an entire replacement engine in this car, in 8 hours. So like I said, this is an expensive endeavor if you are not correct with your diagnosis.
All right, so as you can see, I've got the cylinder head all torn off of this engine. It's back on the bench behind me. I also have the head gasket off the engine as well. So what we're looking at here is simply the top of the engine block. So what we're going to take a look at now is all the different things that a head gasket has to seal. So first of which is the cooling system. If you look around this edge, around all of these cylinders, this is the cooling jacket. So this is where the antifreeze sits that cools the cylinder as you're driving down the road. In addition to having to seal coolant, the head gasket also has to seal the oiling system. So over here in the corner, this is the pressurized oil feed on this engine to send pressurized motor oil from the oil pump up into the cylinder head, namely the camshaft and the rest of the valve train. Now, once you have that oil up in the cylinder head, you have to be able to get it back down into the pan. So these three holes in the back are just simply gravity drain holes that drain the oil back into the pan. So you're sealing pressurized motor oil here at between 40 and 60 psi. You're sealing unpressurized, just gravity-fed motor oil back into the pan in these three locations. So far, you're sealing coolant, you're sealing oil, and finally, you have to also seal combustion. So the head gasket also seals combustion between two cylinders, and it seals combustion into the cooling jacket. So depending on how this head gasket is blown is going to give you different symptoms depending on where it's blown, how it's blown, and what sort of systems are starting to mix with one another, whether it's combustion, cooling, or oil. Now, if you're wondering what some of these other passages are in the cylinder head, really, this one over here is for coolant, and this one here is for an oil return. This one here is for an oil return as well, and the rest of these holes, these are all for the cylinder head bolts. So this is where the cylinder head is physically bolted to the engine block in these small holes here. So that's pretty much everything that is sealed by a head gasket, guys. Hopefully that makes sense for you. Let me take you through how I diagnosed the fact that this head gasket was compromised over in this location. So probably the number one symptom of a blown head gasket when you look out online on the internet is going to be coolant and oil mixing with one another. So engine oil in the radiator, coolant in the oil. Those two things mixing with one another. So why does that happen? So in the case of this particular engine, what's going to happen is you have pressurized motor oil here, like I said, that if you have a blown gasket in this location, the pressurized motor oil at between 40 to 60 psi is going to get pushed into the cooling jacket when the engine is running, because the cooling jacket only has roughly 15 psi of pressure to it, whereas the oiling system has between, like I said, 40 to 60. So the way you get coolant mixing with your oil is actually very, very simple. There's a couple different ways that it could happen. So first of all, you could have a gasket leak between the cooling jacket and the oil return back to the pan in any one of these 3 locations on this particular engine, or it could be happening over here with the pressurized motor oil. So let me explain. Now, when this car is running down the road, like I said, you have 40 to 60 psi of oil pressure coming through this hole that's being sealed by the head gasket. When that head gasket blows in this location and you're running down the road, that oil makes it into the cooling system. The difference is when you turn the car off, the pressure in this cavity automatically goes to 0 within probably 2 seconds of you turning the car off. This pressure here goes to 0. Well, the cooling system holds pressure as long as the engine is hot. So you have 15 psi in the cooling jacket that then is going to push its way back into the oiling system. So you're having a free exchange of coolant and oil due to a blown gasket here, depending on whether the car is running or turned off. So if you're dealing with an engine that has oil in the coolant and coolant in the oil, there's one other thing worth checking, and that is the engine oil cooler. If your vehicle you're dealing with has an engine oil cooler, you need to make sure that that engine oil cooler does not have any holes in it that is allowing the oil to be exchanged with the coolant. Most of these engine oil coolers in 2023, they are a coolant to oil cooler. So if you have a hole in that oil cooler, it's going to freely exchange oil and coolant just like it would with a bad head gasket. So you need to keep that in mind. So the easiest way that you have white smoke, bubbling coolant, and overheating is you have a leak in the head gasket between the cooling jacket and the cylinder. So what's going to happen is as the engine's running down the road, it's going to pressurize the cooling system, and it's going to cause exhaust gas from the combustion process to make its way into the cooling system and specifically into the radiator. So that's why you see a bunch of people doing the tests over on the radiator cap with that special fluid to check for combustion gas. What they're doing is they're checking the seal essentially between the cylinder and the cooling jacket to make sure it's good. Now, where does the white smoke and the misfires and the overheating play into this? So what happens is, just like over here with the oil galley, when you turn the car off, this jacket has pressure in it. So what ends up happening is the leak in the head gasket causes the coolant to leak into the cylinder. When the coolant leaks into the cylinder, that causes the white smoke on startup, the sweet smell of the exhaust, and that can also cause misfires. So the fact that water doesn't burn is naturally going to lead to a misfire. The white smoke and the misfires is usually the most prevalent on cold start after the vehicle's been sitting overnight, and this head gasket's had time to bleed coolant back into the cylinder. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with water getting into the cylinder is if it sits there long enough, it will eventually rust up the cylinder. The other thing that you have to remember too is there is also the possibility that water that's in the cylinder and the coolant that's in the cylinder will work its way past the rings and down into the oil galley that way. So if you're dealing with an engine that has a coolant leak between a cylinder and a cooling jacket, you may have a couple other symptoms that may go along with this. First of which is bubbling coolant. If you pull the radiator cap off a cold engine, fire the car up and just let it run, watch the coolant in the top of the radiator. If it almost immediately starts bubbling, 9 times out of 10, you have a bad head gasket. If you're introducing a bunch of gas into the cooling system, what could also happen is you may airlock the cooling system, so the coolant in the engine will no longer circulate properly, and that will cause the engine to overheat. If the engine overheats, that may cause the cylinder head to warp. If the cylinder head warps, it will blow the head gasket even worse than it already is. if you continue to drive it, you eventually may crack the cylinder head, requiring an entirely new cylinder head, or even crack the block. So, moral of the story is, if the vehicle's overheating, you probably shouldn't be driving it. Now, the final symptom of a bad head gasket can also be external leaks, and that was the case for this engine. Spoiler alert, what I had going on was I had an external coolant leak from about this location over here to the outside of the engine block. And when I raised the car up to do an oil change, I noticed the back of the engine block was covered in coolant. So after doing some investigation, that is what I found. So the next thing that we're going to go over is how I determined that this area of the head gasket was compromised without just tearing the whole engine apart aimlessly. All right, so now that you have an idea what goes on when a head gasket goes bad, it should make this a little bit easier to try and diagnose, a bad head gasket. So this is how I diagnosed this particular car. What I did was I simply pressurized the cooling system. And to pressurize a cooling system, you need a coolant system pressure tester. I'll link them down in the description. They come with a bunch of different adapters, and what this is going to do is the adapter takes the place of the factory radiator cap, and then you have this pump essentially that attaches to the adapter, and then you pump up the pressure in the cooling system until it's what the cap is rated for. So in this case, it's about 16 PSI, and you just let it sit there and see where the leak comes from. Now, in my scenario, as you guys saw, I have an external leak on this car. So when I diagnosed this, I will show you guys, I didn't actually see it leaking, but you could see a clean spot on the cylinder head where you could tell the edge of the cylinder head had actually been steam cleaned by the coolant evaporating out of the head.
So this is just a quick video that I shot with my cell phone just because it was so hard to get my regular camera in here and focused on this spot that we're talking about that's leaking. If you guys take a look here, it's actually right underneath the thermostat housing. You see that shiny spot on the cylinder head, right where the cylinder head meets the block? That is where it was leaking from. This is what typically you're going to find with an external head gasket leak, or even some internal leaks for that matter, is you will find a clean spot where the coolant has actually steam cleaned the area that it has been leaking from.
Now, because I had an external leak, all I needed to do was pressurize the cooling system, get out a flashlight, and just see where my coolant leak was coming from. Now, if you're dealing with some other type of head gasket leak, my suggestion would be use the cooling system pressure tester like this, put some pressure on the cooling system, and just let it sit. And when you let it sit, the next thing I would do is pull all the spark plugs out of the engine and use what's called a bore scope to go down in each cylinder and physically see if you have coolant leaking into the cylinder. For those of you that don't know what a bore scope is, it's essentially a mini camera. This one I have here will Bluetooth to my phone, and I can view the footage from the camera right on my phone. So pull the plugs, get the bore scope out, run it down in the cylinder, and basically play the waiting game and see if you have a coolant leak down into the cylinder. Now, when you run that bore scope down into the cylinder, you will have some indicators that you have a bad head gasket in that cylinder if you know what you're looking for. The easiest thing to look for is a clean piston and a clean cylinder head. The reason that happens is as that coolant is leaking into the cylinder, it is actually steam cleaning the piston and the cylinder head itself. So you will put that bore scope in there and there will be virtually hardly any carbon in the cylinder depending on how bad your head gasket leak is. So look for carbon on the piston or the lack thereof, and that should tell you you're on the right track with the bore scope. So once you figure out which cylinder, looks cleaner than the rest of them, it's kind of just playing the waiting game to see if you physically see the drip into the cylinder from the head gasket with the pressure on the cooling system. Now, to diagnose a head gasket leak between two cylinders, the easiest way to diagnose that is really going to be a compression test. And what you're going to do is you can run a compression test on every cylinder in the engine, but if you have two cylinders that are right next to one another that both have low compression, Generally speaking, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have a blown head gasket between the two cylinders. So one other thing that you guys can use to diagnose a bad head gasket would be a combustion gas detection kit. And what these kits do is, if you guys have bubbling coolant, you take one of these test kits and they have a vial that kind of goes on the top of the radiator cap. Once you have that vial on the top of the radiator cap, you pour in the test fluid and then you draw some of the coolant from the car into the vial. If the test fluid in the vial changes color when the coolant touches it, generally speaking, you have a bad head gasket. Now, you also have the possibility of a cracked cylinder head or a cracked block, but at any rate, the outcome is not good. So that is the final thing that you guys can use. So taking a look here, guys, this is the head gasket that I pulled off this car. Now, it was actually pretty easy to determine, where it was actually leaking, because there's this black coating on the head gasket. And if you looked over here in this corner, the coating's missing. So if you look over here by my index finger, the coating's gone here. Now, if I flip this gasket over and look at the bottom side that was against the engine block, you can see there's a ton of that coating missing. This whole thing should be nice and dark and black like the rest of this that you see here on the outside. This corner was completely compromised. It was not going to be long before this pressurized motor oil galley was going to start pushing into the cooling passage. I just caught it extremely early. All right, so what we're going to talk about now is how long should you actually drive with a blown head gasket. So the easiest way to determine that, guys, it's really going to depend on the type of leak that you have. So in this example that I'm dealing with here, I had an external leak in this corner, like I've said multiple times at this point. So as long as I kept the coolant topped off in this car, more than likely it was going to be fine until I had a leak from the oil galley into the coolant. It was just a matter of time before that started coming across here. The thing is, at that point, once you start getting oil in the coolant and coolant in the oil, you really need to look at changing out the head gasket and sort of fixing the problem, because ultimately antifreeze and water doesn't lubricate nearly as well as motor oil does. And because of that, you're going to cause unnecessary wear to the crankshaft, the rods, the pistons, the cylinder walls, pretty much the rest of the engine if you just run it like that continuously with a bunch of water in the oiling system. So yes, you can run a car for a little while with a blown head gasket. How long that's going to be, that's really going to be dependent on how bad the gasket's blown. The other thing that you need to consider too is that's just oil in the coolant. What happens if you're leaking combustion gases? That is a much more serious thing than some oil in the coolant. The reason that I say that is, let's say, for example, I have a leak between this cylinder and this cylinder right in the middle here. So what's going to happen is, as the engine's running down the road and as those explosions are happening in the cylinder, some of that flame front of the explosion is going to work its way into the other cylinder. So there's going to be a lot of concentrated heat in this portion of the block and the cylinder head. And what's going to happen eventually, it may not happen right away, but you will destroy the engine block and or the cylinder head due to heat coming across this portion of the block. It's like literally holding a blowtorch to the edge of this block, and eventually you'll melt out the section between the two cylinders. And once you've done that, you need an engine. You're done. That's game over. So when you guys say, oh, how long can you run with a bad head gasket? Well, it depends on how bad it's leaking. And the fact of the matter is, until you tear it apart, you have no idea how bad it's leaking. So you might as well just fix it before it causes bigger problems. So guys, in this video, we went over what a head gasket actually seals, when a head gasket goes bad, what the symptoms are, and finally, how to actually diagnose a bad head gasket. So the next video that I'm going to shoot for you guys is going to be how to replace the head gasket on this Honda. It's not going to be super specific to this model, but it's going to give you a very good overview to show you what's involved in this process so you can make the determination if you want to do this or not. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.